The airport terminal was as lively as ever. People walked in every direction, each with their own destination, their own purpose. There was a hum of conversations, the rustle of suitcases, and the clattering sound of rolling luggage. Flight announcements echoed periodically through the speakers, adding to the cacophony of voices and footsteps. It was a busy day, just like any other, yet there was a sense of isolation for some. Among the bustling crowd, one man stood out, but not in a way anyone would have expected. Sitting on a bench near Gate 12, he looked entirely out of place. His clothes were worn and ragged, stained in several places. His shoes, barely held together by frayed laces, seemed as though they'd been through countless miles. His beard was unkempt, his face gaunt, and his hair wild, giving him an appearance that was far from the sleek, polished travelers hurrying through the terminal. His name was Michael, but to the people passing by, he might as well have been invisible. The world saw him as another faceless man in a sea of the homeless. Every day he found a quiet spot in the terminal where he could rest his weary body and blend into the background, hoping that no one would pay attention to him. But today, for some reason, the terminal felt different. It wasn't a dramatic change, but there was something about the air that felt heavier. The looks people gave him, the whispered comments, the sneers. They all felt sharper today, as though he could feel the weight of every glance, every judgment, every passing whisper. As he sat there trying to keep his head down and remain unnoticed, a group of passengers walked by. Their laughter was harsh, piercing through the ambient noise of the terminal like a blade. Their voices carried across the room, louder than most, and every syllable seemed to be aimed directly at him. One man, tall, well-dressed in a sharp suit, caught sight of Michael sitting on the bench. His eyes widened for a brief moment, and then a smirk appeared on his face. "Look at that," he said loudly, enough for others to hear. "A bum sitting in the middle of an airport. Doesn't he know he's out of place here?" Michael froze, a chill running through his spine. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had heard this kind of thing before, heard it so many times that it had become background noise in his life. But today it stung more than usual. The man in the suit nudged his friends, gesturing toward Michael. "I bet he thinks he's going to get some free food or maybe even a free ride," he continued with a sneer. "It's pathetic." The group laughed again, a collective sound of superiority that made Michael's stomach churn. They weren't laughing at him because they thought he was funny. They were laughing at him because they thought he was beneath them. It was the kind of laughter that dehumanized, the kind that reduced a person to nothing more than a spectacle, something to point and laugh at. Michael bit his lip and looked away, trying to block out their voices. He couldn't do anything about it. He had learned that much long ago. Speaking up only made things worse, so he stayed silent, letting the mockery wash over him like a wave crashing against a rock. But it hurt. It hurt more than it had in a long time. A woman in the group, her designer bag hanging from her shoulder, looked over at Michael with a raised eyebrow. "Seriously," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "This place isn't a shelter. He's wasting his time here." "Yeah, maybe he thinks someone's going to take pity on him," another voice added as the group moved past. "Maybe he thinks he's in the right place to get a free meal or a free ticket. Pathetic." The laughter followed them as they walked away. Michael remained still, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't move, didn't respond. There was no point, but the insult lingered, gnawing at his insides, like a slow burn. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shut out the world around him. His chest tightened as he inhaled deeply, the cold air of the terminal seeming to press in on him. Why? Why did they always have to do this? Why was he always the one who had to bear the brunt of their cruelty? The harshness of their laughter seemed to reverberate in his skull, and he pressed his palms into his eyes to try to block it out. It was as though every word they said was carving into him, leaving a mark that he couldn't erase. But as the group of passengers moved away, another presence caught his attention. A man walked past him, a different kind of man. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't rushing to catch a flight or chatting with colleagues. He moved with a quiet confidence, a steady pace that set him apart from the rush of the airport. The man stopped in front of Michael, and for a moment, Michael thought the man might be looking for someone. But instead, the man's eyes focused on him, and he spoke in a voice that was gentle but firm. "Hey, are you okay?" Michael blinked in surprise, looking up at the man. No one ever asked him that. No one ever seemed to care. "I'm fine," Michael said, his voice rough. "Just waiting." The man nodded slowly, seeming to take in the words, then asked, "Waiting for what?" Michael shifted on the bench, unsure how to respond. Waiting for what? He wasn't really sure himself. It wasn't like he was waiting for a grand opportunity or a chance at redemption. No, he was just waiting. Waiting for something, though he didn't know what. "I'm just passing through," Michael replied after a long pause, his voice quieter now. The man studied him for a moment, his gaze searching, as though trying to understand something deeper. "You know," he said softly, "you'd be surprised how many people pass through here thinking they're better than everyone else." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then the man turned and walked away, leaving Michael to digest what had just been said. Michael watched the man's retreating figure, confusion settling in his chest. What had that meant? Why had he said that? The way the stranger had looked at him wasn't pity, wasn't judgment. It was understanding, like he knew something Michael didn't. The hum of the terminal seemed to dull in the wake of the conversation. It was as if the weight of those few words had shifted something inside Michael. The air felt colder, the noise around him louder. It was as though everything was conspiring to draw him into this moment, this realization that today was different. The laughter of the earlier group still echoed in his ears, but now it seemed distant, muted, like it came from another world. And yet the sting remained, a constant reminder of the gulf between the world he occupied and the one the rest of the passengers lived in. Time passed slowly. The announcement came over the loudspeakers as it always did, as if to bring him back to reality. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now boarding Flight 320 to Chicago. Please have your boarding passes ready." Michael's eyes shifted toward the screen listing the flights. But it didn't matter. He didn't have a ticket. He wasn't going anywhere. The terminal was still alive with activity, but it felt alien now. The passengers rushing past, the hurried footsteps, the hurried conversations. It all felt distant, like he wasn't really a part of this world. But it wasn't just that. It was the strange sense of something else that had settled deep inside him. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, he didn't belong here. Maybe he was meant for something else. Maybe today the world would finally see him for who he truly was. The group of passengers who had mocked him earlier were getting ready to board their flight. The man in the sharp suit was talking loudly on his phone, his voice cutting through the terminal with ease. The woman with the designer bag was adjusting her sunglasses, clearly oblivious to everything around her. And all the while, Michael sat on the bench, watching them, feeling that unsettling sensation creeping over him again. They had no idea who he was, and they wouldn't, not yet. But he knew. He knew this was only the beginning. The terminal was alive with noise, as it always was. People were rushing from one gate to another, some clutching their boarding passes, some checking their phones for flight updates. Others were simply walking around, lost in their own thoughts. The quiet hum of the terminal, a constant companion to the whir of luggage wheels and the occasional flight announcement. But amidst the bustle, Michael stood still, feeling the weight of something heavy settling inside him. The laughter, the sneers, the dismissive remarks, they lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. And yet there was something different about today. The gnawing sense of anticipation still held him captive. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like something was about to shift. He could almost feel it in the air, like a change was coming, just on the horizon. The moment he had been waiting for, without even realizing it, was finally here. The group of passengers he had seen earlier were still at the gate, preparing to board their flight. The man in the sharp suit was now talking loudly on his phone, his voice cutting through the air. The woman with the designer bag was adjusting her sunglasses, her head held high, as if she were a queen in a land of lesser beings. They didn't notice him as he walked past, their heads bent in conversation, their words far more important to them than the world around them. But Michael wasn't like them. He wasn't bound by the same rules. He wasn't going to let them see him as the joke anymore. He wasn't going to be invisible, as he had been for so long. Not today. As he passed the group, a strange sense of calm washed over him. The people around him in their perfect little worlds didn't understand what was happening. They couldn't see the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the quiet change that was unfolding before them. Michael reached the counter where the attendants were helping passengers check in for their flights. The clerk behind the counter smiled at him with professional politeness, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that made him pause. She didn't look at him with judgment or pity or disdain. She looked at him like she was seeing something she didn't fully understand. He didn't know why, but he felt a strange sense of urgency, a need to do something, to make his presence known, to show them all who he truly was. He stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "I need to speak to your manager," he said, his tone unshakable. The attendant raised an eyebrow in surprise, her smile faltering for a moment. She didn't argue, though. Instead, she simply nodded and picked up the phone, making a quick call to the back office. As Michael stood there, waiting, he could feel the energy in the terminal shifting. The bustling crowd, the loud conversations, the general feeling of impatience and distraction. It all seemed to fade away, replaced by a strange stillness. The group of passengers at the gate hadn't noticed yet, but soon they would. And when they did, everything would change. A few minutes passed, and then the manager arrived. She was a woman in her late 40s, sharp-eyed and dressed impeccably in the airport's uniform. She approached Michael with the same polite smile she had given the attendant, but as she took in his appearance, her smile slipped just slightly. She glanced down at the ground and then back at him, her professional demeanor still intact. But there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, a trace of doubt. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice as polite as ever, but now laced with a hint of hesitation. Michael didn't waste any time. He wasn't here for small talk, wasn't here to waste anyone's time. He had waited long enough. "I need to talk to you about the passengers at Gate 12, Michael said, his voice steady, unwavering. "The ones who were mocking me." The manager's brow furrowed slightly, her eyes shifting from confusion to discomfort. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to," she said, her voice now sounding slightly more cautious. Michael's gaze didn't waver. He met her eyes, holding her attention with a quiet confidence. "I don't think you fully understand who I am," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But you will." The manager blinked, her face flushing slightly as she took in his words. She wasn't sure what he meant, but there was something in his voice, something in the way he stood that made her uneasy. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the counter behind her, as if seeking support. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice now laced with confusion. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, simple business card. It was sleek, black with elegant gold lettering. He handed it to the manager without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing the smooth surface, and her eyes immediately went to the name on the front. Michael Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises. Her hand trembled slightly as she read the words on the card, her face draining of color as the weight of the situation began to settle over her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The terminal seemed to hold its breath, the surrounding noise fading into the background. The manager's eyes flicked between the card and Michael, her expression slowly changing from confusion to disbelief, and then finally to realization. Michael stood tall, watching her as she processed the information. There was no rush. There was no need to fill the silence. The truth had landed like a hammer, and now it was time for the pieces to fall into place. I didn't know," she stammered, looking back at the group of passengers at Gate 12, who had been laughing and chatting just moments ago, completely unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. "They didn't know either," Michael replied, his voice calm but firm. "But they will." The manager glanced nervously at the group of passengers, their backs turned, oblivious to the unfolding drama. "Sir, You should have known," Michael interrupted, his tone cutting through the air. "But it's too late now." Without waiting for her response, he turned toward the passengers, who were still gathered at the gate. He walked slowly, purposefully, his every step measured. The group had stopped talking now, the man in the sharp suit still on his phone, the woman with the designer bag adjusting her sunglasses, but none of them were looking at him. They didn't notice as Michael approached. They didn't know what was coming. When he was just a few feet away, Michael stopped, his presence now undeniable. The group turned as one, sensing something had changed. The man in the suit, the one who had mocked him so loudly earlier, looked up from his phone and locked eyes with Michael. For a moment, there was silence. The man blinked, his confident expression faltering, his eyes widening in recognition as he took in Michael's calm demeanor. You own this airport? The man asked, his voice now filled with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. Michael didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. The group stood still, unsure of what to do. The woman with the designer bag, her face flushed with embarrassment, looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The rest of the group shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado quickly fading into awkward silence. The weight of their mistake was now clear. "I think it's time you learned a valuable lesson," Michael said softly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "The world doesn't revolve around you. There's more to people than what you see on the surface, and it's time you stopped looking down on others just because they don't look like you." The group stood frozen, their expressions shifting from confusion to regret. The sharp-suited man, who had been so quick to mock, now looked small and unsure, like a child caught doing something they shouldn't. Michael turned to the manager, who was still standing there, her face pale. She hadn't said a word, but her eyes were wide with realization. "Let them board their flight," Michael said, his voice quiet now. "But let them know this. They don't own this airport, and they never will." As he turned to walk away, Michael couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the humiliation. It wasn't about making them pay for their cruelty. It was about showing them the truth. And now they saw it.